Hello, welcome back to Global. I'm John Sopel. Now, the United Nations estimates that 2.5 million people were trafficked across the world last year. 75% of those victims were women and girls, and most of them, let me get my kind of facts absolutely sorted out here, and most of them were trafficked for sexual exploitation. Now, what is trafficking exactly? It's defined by various bodies, including the UK Home Office, as essentially the recruitment, movement or receipt of a person by deception or coercion into a situation of exploitation. This may include prostitution or other forms of sexual exploitation, slavery, servitude and the removal of organs. Now, that is the legalistic definition that the Home Office came up with. Well, with me again is our guest editor, Dr. Brooke Magnanti. We're also joined by Heather Harvey, who is from the charity The Eves Project, Sonia Qureshi, who is from the charity Kismet Foundation, and Sarah Walker, who is head of the English Collective of Prostitutes. And welcome to you all, and thank you very much indeed. I kind of rather gabbled that mouthful of that legalistic definition. Is it a good definition?
I think it's limited because there's a problem with the whole definition of trafficking, and one of the problems is that there's an industry, and that industry has not distinguished between consenting sex and sex which is against our will, which is a fundamental basis of the women's movement. So the work that we try to do is distinguish between consenting sex work and victims of trafficking, which obviously we are very concerned about women's safety and victims of trafficking.
Brooke, let me bring you in there, because of course you did work as a sex worker for a while, yes, but it was entirely voluntary, I think, and it was, I mean, you were doing, let me ask you, why did you do it?
Well, I did it because the situation I was in as a student, I was here on a student visa, so I was forbidden from working more than 15 hours a week by the Home Office. I had a shortfall in my funding, and I was extremely concerned about staying on the right side of the law, and I thought, well, what's a job that I can do where I can earn my rent, continue to look for work? Because the alternative for me would have meant leaving the UK without my qualifications as a scientist and giving up on a science career. So I think it attracted attention because it's an unusual story, but I think that there's so much tied in with the economics of it, and absolutely agree that we need to make this distinction. And also when we talk about trafficking, not only the women involved in the sex labour industry, but also men and people involved in domestic servitude.
But I think it's right to say that your situation is very different. Here, you were there kind of trying to earn some extra money. It was to top up your income so you could carry on with your studies, rather than what we've seen of some of these people who have been brought to this country against their will and have no kind of voluntary aspect to it whatsoever.
Well, I think the thing is, when we look at the statistics, because obviously there were enormous sweeps in London prior to the Olympics, trying to close down red light areas, trying to find victims of trafficking, because we always hear these statistics that these things go up in relation to large sporting events, and in the end they actually didn't find the people that they were supposed to be looking for. This is something that I really worry about in the discussion of trafficking. It's not that it doesn't occur and that it isn't serious, because it does and it is, but we're looking for a needle in a haystack. We really need good directed information for law enforcement to be working with.
Heather, tell me about some of the work that you've come across, what work you've done and what experiences you've come across.
Yeah, well, Eves is a charity that works on all forms of violence against women and girls, and we perceive prostitution as a form of exploitation and inequality, which is disputed by some. But in our work, we have the Poppy Project, which helps victims of, well, female victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation or for labour exploitation, mainly domestic servitude. We also have a project which helps women who want to exit prostitution, and we do some research around it. But I think one of the things that you said to Brooke earlier was that her situation was entirely different. And actually, I think the one thing, wherever you stand on the prostitution debate, I think we're all sharing some common territory here, which is that the actual factors that enable prostitution and trafficking often come from very similar roots, whether that is poverty, whether it is sexual exploitation, it's childhood violence, it's problems of that nature, or financial problems. And I think we would all agree the fact that we have such stringent immigration conditions actually makes it facilitates trafficking, because you don't have legal routes to migrate. And from our perspective at EASE, we would like to be able to see women from all over the world, of every degree of skill and ability, being able to travel and make a new life for themselves without necessarily having to look at prostitution as the answer.
The question I want to ask you is, what do you think is the extent of the problem? Are we talking, I mean, you know, your work is here in the UK. Are we talking about a few people, dozens of people, hundreds, thousands? I mean, it's very hard to get the scale of what we're discussing.
Yeah. It is very hard to get the scale, I totally agree. And in fact, I'm not even sure that it's that helpful trying to put numbers on it, because it's so unclear. It's a hidden issue. As is prostitution, it's very much hidden, it's very underground. If you take the UK Human Trafficking Centre statistics, which are also quite flawed and quite limited, I would argue, but if you take that, then they were saying there were some 2,255 people who were potential victims of trafficking in the UK, but they actually identified, I think, 778 as either actual victims of trafficking. But you see, there's lots of arguments about whether that's a useful statistic or not, but I don't know, maybe Sunir might want to...
Let me just bring in Sunir, and I will bring you back in. Go on.
I do agree with Heather that the statistics is very mired. The fact that a lot of Home Office sort of discussions and debates are around the national referral mechanism, which means people who are actually confirmed to come through a system as confirmed traffickees, and that is in its thousands. So that's just your official stats. There are a number of people underneath that layer who are not on the radar for various reasons, because of the various methods of trafficking that occur, the various gender and sort of industries that are linked to that trafficking. I think there is a lot more, like Dr. Brooks said, a lot of data that's missing on this, and also the sensibilities. A lot of the traffickees are treated and criminalized. So if they know they're going to be criminalized, they are not going to come forward.
Yes,
so that's your
Sarah,
first bugbear.
Part of the problem is that the Poppy Project, for example, has been one of the projects that has bolstered these very bogus figures. For example, they did a survey which said that 80% of the sex workers working indoors in London were trafficked, which is absurd. What they did was that every immigrant sex worker was put down as a victim of trafficking. That doesn't help victims, it doesn't help anyone. And then that has been used as a basis for raids on premises in Soho, in Mayfair, in Birmingham just recently. They raided 30 premises. They found 5 women who they said were trafficked, but no traffickers were arrested. So it is a very big problem. And what's happening is the legislation that Poppy Project and Eves and others have backed has actually made it harder for sex workers and has driven sex work underground and made it harder for victims to come forward. And frankly, many of the victims of trafficking have actually been saved by sex workers.
Heather, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, just to clarify, we didn't actually say that 80% were trafficked. We said that particular survey you're referring to was one that had, in that particular sample, 80% of the women were interviewed were foreign and therefore could have been trafficked. We never claimed that they were, but that gets misconstrued by the media.
When the MP McShane put that forward in the House of Commons, you didn't say anything. That lie, they were claiming that 25,000 women a year were being brought into Britain, which is just ridiculous.
You know what it's like with the media. It's very hard to actually put your story back in.
Distorted figures do not help women escape from trafficking.
I absolutely agree with you.
Women are not getting the resources. Okay. Women have come to us
Sarah,
and have ended up locked up in prison.
You made your point. Heather.
I was going to say, I do agree with you, distorted figures isn't helpful, and media not giving you a chance to actually put the corrected figures doesn't help either. But I think again, I want to come back to some of the areas where we agree, because in Poppy Project, 34% of our referrals are coming from prisons and immigration detention centres, and it's precisely because they're being missed by and the current service provision is actually not helping women. It is a holding pen for immigration deportation,
Can I just ask you to answer very briefly? Do you think that all sex workers are victims?
No. I feel that, for me, I would question whether women genuinely really want to do prostitution, apart from a lot of very limited options. As Brooke said herself, you know, she did it partly because it was topping up her work, because she couldn't work legally. And I think that's what I want to come back to. What's the reality of the choice involved? But that's actually just, can I just finish? Yeah. The thing that we're concerned about is, even where there are women who will say they're thoroughly enjoying it, we deal with the people who are not enjoying it, and our law and our policy needs to help the people who need support, and that's where I'm coming from.
OK. Do you think that all sex workers are victims?
No, I don't think that all sex workers are victims. I do think economic necessity drives a lot of what we all do for work. Right. We do all need to work. And I think
but isn't that in everything? Whether you are working in a field picking leeks, yeah. You know,
I didn't wait tables because I love to give people food. You know? We've all had jobs that had some aspect of you are serving someone so that you can get this, you know, it's wage slavery that you're taking home. But I do think that what's been missing from the discussion, especially around sex trafficking specifically, is a lot more involvement with the sex workers themselves, because very often sex workers are the best placed people to identify who they know, and the camaraderie that you see of women working together, they're the ones who look out for each other on the day-to-day basis before somebody goes to a crisis centre.
Exactly.
Do you think there is a greater awareness of the authorities now of the scale of the problem of people trafficking across Europe, and are actually starting to grapple with it?
I think the problem is that this government and previous ones, they focus on trafficking to deport, to detain, and that is the fundamental problem. And they are not providing resources for the victims. Unless you provide housing, health care, and the right to stay, then the victims will not be able to come forward.
And Sonia, I'm wondering whether you've come across the kind of, you know, the other forms of trafficking as well, which, you know, have just got equally hideous manifestations. Yes. You know, gang labour, even small children.
In fact, you rightly raised that, because it's quite alarming. There's a consistent increase in minors being trafficked into the UK, and that's a mixture of sexual exploitation and now organ harvesting. So it's quite a shocking reality. And going to your previous question, I think the authorities are just about to begin to grapple with this problem because of globalization, and that comes with any criminal activity as well. You have gang masters, and you have certain points across Europe and Eastern Europe that become the focal points, whether it's from China, Taiwan, Albania and Nigeria are your top ethnic backgrounds of people being trafficked. But you see increases in other ethnicities because there is more of a reach, there's more poverty, there's more desperation. And within that, women and minors are your biggest cohort of victims.
And the other end, of course, is the demand. None of it would be happening if there wasn't a demand for it.
But women are moving country to be able to feed their families.
I know.
That's the reality.
Okay. Sorry, Sarah. On that note of harmony, we're going to have to end it because we're out of time. And we've just been talking to nobody in a few moments. But thank you all very much for being with us. And, of course, Brooke will be back with us in a few moments' time. Do stay with us.